started off with a group called Te Auru Claimant Collective, which was one of 5 groups that was set up by Maniapoto to look after the Maniapoto negotiations and to do the claims for Maniapoto. And that group came out of the West Coast harbours, so it was Kapia and that sort of thing. So there was a couple of us elected onto a group called Te Kauamaro. First of all, it was a setting group organised to do the Maniapoto claims. But then we became Te Kauamaro, and John Carty and I, John Carty from Kapia and I were the 2 elected to represent our group. There was some argy-bargy go on between us and the Crown for a long period of time, but we successfully held the court proceedings, a number of those, Te Kuiho, and then the proceedings themselves, the tribunal proceedings themselves, over, I don't know, maybe 10 years, something like that, 2000. It must have been early 80s, early 90s. We had to set up for the hearings. The big thing for us in Maniapoto was that when Waikato Tainui settled, they didn't do proceedings in the tribunal. So it was settled without going to the tribunal. So for a lot of the Maniapoto kaumātua and now tupuna, it was important that the story was told. And although the Crown came in with a really early offer for settlement, we didn't want to settle because the story hadn't been told about what had happened when the colonial forces came into the Waikato, that whole process. We ran into lots of barriers by the treaty settlements, saying that we could only talk south of the Pūnia River, because they'd settled with Waikato Tainui north of the Pūnia River. But eventually we managed to say, well, hold on, the Raputu claimed and everything that happened in the wars in the southern part of the Waikato also, were also important to Maniapoto, and at that stage we were also talking Apakura and Hinetu and all of the hapu on that side. It was important that, we do that. We then ended up with the Crown saying to us, well, hold on, Apakura settled with Waikato Tainui, so they couldn't be part of Maniapoto. And we were saying, but hold on, we're settling now. The claim is about Apakura and Hinetu being chased off their lands and ending up with Maniapoto and more particularly with Tūwharetoa, who were also in negotiations at that point in time. Of course, some of our tupuna went north as well. But yeah, there's a whole history of the Trail of Tears when you get to talking about Tūwharetoa, and He Pātauhau is the waiata that relates to that Trail of Tears. The opposite treaty settlements said, no, Apakura can't be part of it. We'd already invited Apakura in to the Maniapoto negotiations, and they were pretty strong and said, no, Apakura couldn't be there. We then changed it and said, well, if Apakura can't be there, we at least want them to observe the process, to be an observer. And they said, no, they can't be observers. So there was quite a battle took place. And, we were thinking, well, it was about, double dipping in terms of the treaty settlements, because we were interconnected and interrelated. So how could you do that separation? Apakura was at that point excluded. There was some other aru that went on. The Trust Board eventually took over the negotiations for Maniapoto. And at that point, I left the Maniapoto negotiations, went back and began to have a conversation with our people about, now where do we stand in terms of being Apakura and Hinetu. The upshot of that was that we managed to get Waikato Tainui through negotiations with Rahui Papa and a few others, and Keith Aiken, even though Maniapoto was trying to get their settlement, Keith Aiken and the Maniapoto Trust Board were supportive. And we got those 2, significant iwi to align and say, you're in the process of settling with Maniapoto and you're settled with Waikato Tainui. But we were aware that in Taranaki, the Crown had done a separate settlement for Parihaka. And the Parihaka settlement was going through the courts at the time. And they called that a reconciliation process, not a settlement process. I think it was at one of the hui we had, because there were a few blocks to be talked about with the Crown, Tokanui block amongst those. And Annette Sykes, I think, was the person that was leading it, and it was Annette that talked to us about Parihaka. And so I thought, that's something worth looking at. So I went down and I looked at the way that they did the reconciliation for Parihaka. So we lined up Waikato Tainui because we begun to have a few early conversations with the treaty settlements at that point in time. And we lined up Waikato Tainui, Rahui and Maniapoto with Ki Laikan. And we had a hui at the School of Law with Rob Josephs and a few others of us. I'm forgetting more, pretty significant number of hui that we'd had as Apakura, where we met at Purikiriki, we met out at Kāwhia, and I think we met at a couple of other places where Apakura was saying we need to do something. And so we had a conversation and a few of us were elected. We talked about, this reconciliation, went into that in detail, and a few of us were elected. Hazel Wanda, George Griggs, Harry Millwood, Dr. Rob Josephs, Tom Roa, and myself. That group was elected to talk with the Office of Treaty Settlements to get together Tūwharetoa, and Tom can give you some information on why he chose that name. Just off the top of my head, I think it may have had something to do with the Hingikaka, and one of our tupuna chief at Hingikaka, Tūwharetoa. So that group was elected at the hui at Purikiriki, and we met with the Office of Treaty Settlements, met with Waikato Tainui, met with Maniapoto. We also met with the King's Office at that point in time, remembering, of course, that Potato Te Whenua, that lineage also comes from Apakura. We wanted to make sure that we included that. We had an early conversation with Tūwharetoa because, part of the reconciliation is what happened after the colonial forces took over, attacked us and took over the whenua. So there was a lot of early negotiations going on. We then ended up with what we were hoping was a four-way agreement, and I've got copies of that somewhere. That four-way agreement was between Waikato Tainui, Maniapoto, and us, and was supposed to include the Crown. But the Crown didn't like a lot of the details because we'd actually identified the sorts of things that we thought that the Crown should be making restitution for inside this document. And it was important that we had a document to process this because, we weren't able to undo any Crown treaty settlements that had already occurred. And that was a big part of it. And it said that in the document. So we progressed this process for reconciliation with the help of Rob Josephs and Tom and the other members. Rob Joseph did a history for us, paid for by the Office of Treaty Settlements. One of the things that the Crown wanted to know is, well, what was the history of Rangiaowhia? And as many times as we would tell them, they wanted it recorded, Crown processes, all of that sort of stuff. So Rob Josephs did a lot of that. They were careful to say, well, we want to know who's there and who was there at the time. Well, we don't have a lot of that record, apart from the kōrero that went on. And as Apakura and Hinetu, we don't have a lot of the whakapapa. It's beginning to develop, but at that point in time, we didn't have a lot of the whakapapa either. That was so the reconciliation went on from there. We had a big meeting, big hui at the racecourse, where we invited the minister at that time, Andrew Little, and we managed to get an understanding. We didn't get our four-way agreement signed. It was signed by Waikato Tainui, Maniapoto, and ourselves, but not by the Crown. But what the Crown did offer is to give us a letter from the minister of Treaty Settlements at that point in time, saying he was okay. It was written by the bureaucrats and passed through the law proceedings and all of that sort of thing. And so he said, yes, I'll accept that you can go on and have some initial discussions and about a reconciliation process for Rangiaowhia. He agreed to that, and one of the major parts of that, and I've got to say this, is that Waikato Tainui and Maniapoto agreed to this, is that Apakura had to lead this process, and Apakura was central to the process. And I use that word central because that was written into the correspondence, was central to the process. That was a big must for us, that any process that went on, we had to be central to it. Rob Joseph's historical account and the help of Maniapoto Parel in putting that together. The Crown didn't. That account wasn't accepted. It was our tikuriho in regards to what had occurred and needed to be sent off. The Opposite Treaty Settlement sent that off to somebody in Christchurch University to peer review the document from the Crown's perspective. And so that was interesting in terms of our process as well, because we were reconciling with the Crown in terms of the mamae that happened at Rangiaowhia. What they did was get their historians to check the work that Maniapoto and Rob Joseph said done. I don't think that there wasn't a contest as such in regards to that research, because there wouldn't be anybody that could contest it. Then we began, the reconciliation continued on to the second phase. And in the second phase, the key stuff there was how the reconciliation would occur. After we had Rob Joseph's and Maniapoto's report, we knew what the iwi were that were involved at Rangiaowhia. So we had to set up and go out and meet with each of the other iwi that were involved. Te Arawa, Te Arawa Waka, Tūwharetoa. We went down and met with Sutamu Te Huhu. We had 2 meetings with Sutamu, and I still think about that and that who was involved in that. And one of the things for me is that Sutamu took me aside and said to me, so boy, when are you coming to take your people home? Because, he was talking about all those that are buried, died and buried in Tūrangi in particular. And there's a history that's to be told yet in that regard. They didn't do it during their treaty settlements. And so we got all of those iwi to agree, Waikato Tainui, Maniapoto, Tūwharetoa, Te Arawa. It's pretty, it's pretty big stuff. And getting all of those iwi to agree that Apakura could actually run this reconciliation process and be central to it. One of the big things for me in terms of our negotiations with the Crown was that I don't want to be doing the negotiations on behalf of those other iwi that were affected by what happened at Rangiaowhia. It's not for us to do. If you give us a settlement, then the way we are is that we would have to give that to all those other people. We are only alive today. A lot of us are only alive today, Apakura and Hinetu, only because of what these Apu did. And the manaaki, their manaaki. Our manaaki would be that we give anything that the Crown gives to us back to them. So we came up with a document that said that there would be 2 stages to the reconciliation. And this is new because they never did that at Taranaki. I'm still having a little bit of a discussion with Nanaya about this. There would be a stage that, because she's become the negotiator for Apakura, there would be a stage where Apakura did its negotiations and got compensation and reconciliation. And then there would need to be a stage that where Tūwharetoa, Maniapoto, Waikato Tainui and Te Arawa all had an opportunity to discuss how they were affected by Rangiaowhia, because there's mamae for them there. And that was recognised. That was the Tūhoi recognised that, and one of their chiefs that was over at Patarangi that went across back to Rangiaowhia, where he'd left his wahine and mokopuna, and they were all killed. And he went on the rampage up at Tūhoi at that point in time. Said these are all things for them, And we've got that now, that movie about that component at Orakau, but before Orakau, there was all the damage that had been done at Haerini, in the little skirmish that occurred at Haerini, which is on Rangiaowhia Road. But recently I've been talking to the Apakura negotiators, Nanaya, Stephen Wilson, that there is a second stage, which I don't know that they necessarily were aware of when they began the process, and was able to refer them to a letter that we co-constructed. Interestingly enough, we co-constructed this letter with the Office of Treaty Settlements to make sure that the mamae and the length and the breadth of the mamae was heard. We got a letter from the minister saying, yes, he agreed to the fact that there would be 2 stages to this negotiation, one for Apakura and one for the other iwi. However, Apakura would be part of the negotiations that went on for the other iwi. because we were to be central, going back to that original correspondence, we would be central to this process. And so we needed to be there to say, why they're having this second set of negotiations. And to be honest with you, and I'm speaking for myself here, it's our duty to front foot it. It's our mamae. It's, our survival was based upon that. I don't believe it's for them to make sure that this happens. It's for us to make sure it happens. Everyone played a part in Te Wahatura, having Dr. Tom Roa as the kaumātua, the mentor, as part of that process. Dr. Rob Josephs is, historian, his knowledge of law and the language. I gotta say, Rob's beautiful in the language. And then, we've got the history behind that with Moipatu, and Hazel and Harry had to leave us earlier on, but and go back north, Harry Mid, George Crigg's always a supporting cast, and often we don't always remember the supporting cast, or they don't always get acknowledged.